and welcome to episode number 12 of the Dose of Wonder podcast. I'm your host, Caitlin McCall. Okay, so have you ever said something to a friend or family member that they thought was really strange? Like maybe that a certain song sounded orange, or that you could see music, or maybe that the number 5 is green to you? If so, you may have synesthesia, a neurological condition that scientists are still trying to figure out more about and why it happens. It's almost like the brain is having this wild sensory party, mixing up sights and sounds and tastes in ways that I think most of us can't even begin to grasp. It's really remarkable how it all comes together. The word synesthesia means to blend the 5 senses. People with synesthesia, known as synesthetes, experience the world differently. To put it simply, think of it like crossed wires in their brains. Their senses are hooked up to each other in weird ways, where one sensory source produces another result, such as tasting sounds or hearing colors. There are many different types of synesthesia, such as chromesthesia. One of the most common forms of this condition is known as grapheme color synesthesia, where people will see letters or numbers with different colors, which I'll get into a little bit later on in the podcast. But first, let's get into some interesting tidbits. The first being that most people are born with it and it runs in families. Some researchers think that everyone has synesthesia when they're born, but that you just grow out of it as you grow up. But there are cases of people developing it later on in life. Both of these are called developmental synesthesia. But some people suddenly gain these abilities due to medical issues like strokes, tumors, or brain injury. And this is known as acquired synesthesia. Also, the condition can be inherited, and that about 40% of synesthetes have another close family member with it. And scientists have discovered that a specific gene on chromosome 16 causes grapheme color synesthesia, but they don't know why. And scientists also think that 0.5 to 1% of all people have this condition. So synesthesia might be a lot more common than people think. Like estimates suggest that maybe 2 to 4% of people, they experience some form of mixing up sights and sounds and tastes. So that means that chances are pretty good that you've met someone with it, maybe without even realizing it. This kind of makes me wonder, could there be people out there, maybe with like a milder form of it, and they just think it's totally normal? Like maybe someone always pictures Tuesdays as green, but they just assume that everyone else does too. It really speaks to how deeply embedded these experiences can be for people with synesthesia. Often it's not until they try to explain what they're perceiving and other people just don't understand. That's when they realize that, oh, this is actually unique to me. Another interesting thing about synesthesia is that left-handed people and women are more likely to have it. Again, scientists don't know why. But it turns out that studies in the US show that women are 3 times more likely, and in the UK for some reason, 8 times more likely to have it. And strangely, more synesthetes are left-handed compared to the rest of us. And another strange aspect of this condition is that when people with synesthesia are sick, their abilities can change. When a synesthete comes down with a cold, flu, or something like an ear infection, being sick can affect how they experience their condition, either strengthening or weakening it, or that it's just out of whack and not right. For example, a sound color synesthete with a blocked ear will not only lose their hearing, but the colors they usually experience will be different. And if you have the condition and also depression, you might find that it temporarily leaves altogether. And there are 2 other major groups of synesthetes. One is called projective, where the person hears, smells, tastes, or feels the second sense, and where it is projected in front of you. For example, tasting the flavor of blueberries when you hear a specific piano note. The second is associative, meaning that they have a connection between a stimulus and a sense, but only associate it in their minds, not directly experiencing it. With the first example, where that first group actually tastes blueberries hearing a certain note, someone in the second group would just have an association between the note and blueberries. In other words, that piano note would remind them or make them think of blueberries. Of course, someone could belong to a mix of both of these groups. Some more rarer forms of synesthesia are auditory tactile, or hearing touch, where sounds cause the person to feel sensations inside or outside their bodies, sometimes pleasant, other times not so much. Similar to that is mirror touch, where they can feel pain if they see someone else in pain. Not very fun, right? Another rare form is lexical gustatory and sound gustatory, where people can taste, smell, or feel words, either spoken or written, either in the mouth as if actually eating it, or it evokes the tastes in their mind. And one of the rarest forms of synesthesia is misophonia, which is having negative experiences to sounds, such as breathing and chewing. One cool fact about synesthesia is that you can teach yourself it. Synesthesia has many benefits, and it can help with memory and creativity. According to psychology professor Berit Brogard, who has the condition herself, you can teach yourself some tricks for learning it by associating two different things together, but it takes practice and patience. Once you start associating two things together, you start to build new neural pathways in the brain. If you learn to associate colors with something else, that can help you remember things, because we remember colors more easily than other things. You can use meditation or the practice of mindfulness to help you perceive and experience synesthesia. Mindfulness is shifting your attention to your senses, so that learning to become aware of your senses can help you to start to perceive synesthesia, as most people with the condition don't actually realize that they have it. But are there any risks to intentionally trying to train your brain to make these sensory connections? It's something that researchers are still looking into, but there's no evidence to suggest that it's harmful. But like with any kind of brain training, I think that a healthy dose of caution is always a good idea. So while there's no red flags, it's probably best to err on the side of caution, and maybe work with some qualified professionals if you're really serious about it. And it's also important to remember that learning synesthesia is not a quick fix. It takes time and effort, and you have to be consistent. It's not like you can just flip a switch and suddenly you're experiencing the world in this whole new way. There's no magic pill for synesthesia. It takes practice and dedication and a real willingness to embrace new ways of thinking and perceiving. But even if you don't actually achieve full-blown synesthesia, the process of training your brain and trying to make those connections can still be beneficial. It can help you pay attention to detail better, improve your memory, and even boost your creative thinking skills. And here's something slightly different from synesthesia. It's called ideasthesia. Ideasthesia is a kind of offshoot of synesthesia. So synesthesia is when a sensory experience is associated with another sense. For example, when you hear music, you see a color. Ideasthesia is when a concept, like a letter or number, which aren't real things but abstract concepts, triggers a sensory experience, like seeing a certain color. And concepts can also trigger other concepts, like a letter or a number can have a gender or a personality. They aren't senses, but they are ideas. So let's get into synesthesia a bit deeper. Possibly a lot of us have heard that thing about seeing sounds as colors, but it seems like there's way more to it than that. So as I said, one of the most common types of synesthesia is chromesthesia, where a person hears a sound and sees a color associated with it. High-pitched sounds are often brighter colors, and lower sounds are darker. And different people may see a certain sound as a different color. So that version of synesthesia is pretty well known, but there are actually over 80 different types, believe it or not, that have been documented. Each one kind of linking different senses in these really mind-boggling ways. Our senses can be linked with each other in a large combination of ways, and also with other things like personality traits. And most people with the condition only have two senses linked, like sight and sound. But some have 3 or more. And according to the website betterhelp.com, there have been at least one case where someone had connections between all 5 senses. For example, as I mentioned before, you could have what's called lexical gustatory synesthesia, which means that someone might actually taste words. So if they read the word Wednesday, they might get a distinct taste of pineapple. So you can totally see why people might have trouble wrapping their heads around that. It definitely changes our normal understanding of how our senses should be working, and that can lead to some social challenges for people with synesthesia. Imagine trying to explain that you taste the days of the week and people are looking at you like you're making it up. That must be so isolating, especially for kids who might not even have the words to explain what they're going through. It's no wonder that a lot of synesthetes feel misunderstood. And on top of that social aspect, there are all these kind of cognitive and perceptual quirks that can come with synesthesia. For example, if you have grapheme color synesthesia, where, as I said before, each number has its own specific color, math might feel really counterintuitive to you. Let's say the number 2 is pink and 3 is blue, but then 5 is red. That doesn't really jive with how color is actually mixed, right? Or the letter A might be yellow and 12 might be a shade of blue. The brain is basically giving people conflicting information. That would make learning certain things very difficult. And then you have people with that sound color synesthesia. For them, even loud noises like a fire alarm could be really overwhelming. Just imagine this intense sound triggering this equally intense, maybe even blinding burst of color. It's not really helpful when you're trying to get out of a dangerous situation. It really makes you think about how differently we all experience the world, doesn't it? It's easy to fall into that trap of assuming that everyone perceives things the same way we do. But synesthesia is a pretty powerful reminder that that's just not true. Imagine actually feeling a physical touch, but that's because you're watching someone else being touched, which, as I said earlier, is what is called mirror touch synesthesia. Or maybe you're having a conversation, and as people are talking, you see their words scrolling across your vision. Those old school news tickers? That one is called ticker tape synesthesia. So with ticker tape synesthesia, it would maybe make it almost impossible to actually follow a conversation. There's also a kind of synesthesia where letters or numbers have personalities, called ordinal linguistic personification, or OLP for short. It's where people experience things like numbers or the alphabet as having these distinct personalities. So the number 7 might be a real grump, while the letter A is this cheerful leader type. Isn't that just crazy? Each synesthete's experience is totally unique. It's incredibly personal and often very detailed. It's like each person has this personalized sensory symphony playing out in their mind. So even though that there's these general categories, each person's synesthesia is kind of like their own unique mix of the senses. And most people with synesthesia, they'll only have 1 or 2 senses that are linked. So people experience even more these really intricate connections. And it's important to remember that not all synesthetes experience these sensory blends in the same way. And researchers have identified 2 main types of synesthetes: projectors and associators. Projectors actually experience their synesthesia as being projected externally. If they hear a certain sound, it makes them taste chocolate, they actually physically taste the chocolate. So getting back to the 2 main types of synesthetes that I mentioned before for some more examples, the projectors and associators, or projective and associative, where projectors actually experience their synesthesia as being projected externally. If they hear a certain sound, it makes them taste chocolate, they actually physically taste the chocolate, even though there's no chocolate anywhere near them. Their brain is creating that taste sensation purely based on the sound. But with the associators type, it's different. They'll have a really strong mental association, but it's not an actual external projection. So they might think really intensely about chocolate when they hear a sound, but they don't actually taste chocolate. So it's more like a strong mental image or connection for the associators. Whereas the projectors, they have the actual sensory experience. It's another layer of complexity to the whole phenomenon. So synesthesia is like a key to understanding the brain itself. What's really interesting is some researchers actually think that synesthesia might have played a role in how our early ancestors survived. Back then, you're constantly on the move, hunting, gathering, trying not to become someone else's lunch. Being able to quickly spot patterns and make decisions in a split second is essential. And synesthesia, with its heightened senses, could have been a huge advantage. If you could instantly connect a sound with a visual cue, maybe a certain way the leaves rustle means there's prey nearby, or if you could link a specific smell with the location of a dangerous predator. That kind of sensory edge could literally save your life back then. It makes you wonder how many of our ancestors might have had synesthesia and just never thought it was anything out of the ordinary. It's fascinating to think about. And it brings us to today, even though we're not hunting mammoths anymore. But does synesthesia still offer any advantages in our modern world? It might help with memory and creativity, but there are some other potential benefits that researchers have found. There are some studies out there that suggest that people with synesthesia might be really good at spatial reasoning. Maybe because their brains are kind of wired to connect different spatial representations. So they have a real good sense of direction, and they're good at visualizing things in 3D. So they'd be naturals at things like reading maps or geometry. And there's also some evidence that synesthetes might even be more empathetic than the average person. Because their senses are so intertwined, they may be extra sensitive to the emotional states of other people. They pick up on cues that other people might miss. I mean, if you're literally feeling what someone else is feeling, you'd definitely be more tuned in to their emotions. It's like they'd have this built-in emotional radar. And you could see how that could be really valuable in certain jobs, like therapists, counselors, teachers, even artists. It's amazing how these unusual sensory connections can impact different parts of someone's life. So, what are scientists really hoping to find out? Well, one of the main goals is to understand the actual neuroscience behind it, to figure out exactly which area of the brain and which pathways are involved. Because if we can do that, we can gain a much deeper understanding of how all our senses work together and how we actually perceive reality. So it's not just about studying synesthesia on its own, it's about using it as a tool to understand the bigger picture of how the brain works. Synesthesia offers this unique window into the complexity of the brain, and it could hold clues about all kinds of things, like consciousness, perception, and even maybe creativity. So, for the listeners who are maybe wondering if they have synesthesia, what are some signs that you should be on the lookout for? Well, the most important thing is consistency. Like if you always see the number 5 as blue without fail. Or if hearing a certain word always triggers a specific taste, that could be a sign. These associations are automatic and involuntary. It's not something you're doing on purpose. So it's not just random. Like I happen to think of blue when I see 5 today, but tomorrow it's a different color. There's a definite pattern. And also, synesthetic experiences tend to be really vivid and kind of emotionally intense. It feels real, like an integral part of how you experience the world, not just a fleeting thought or something you're imagining. So if someone thinks they have synesthesia, what do they do next? Where do they start? There are actually some online resources, like there's this thing called the Synesthesia Battery. It's a standardized test designed to identify potential synesthetes, so you can kind of get a preliminary assessment. But of course, for a formal diagnosis, it's always best to talk to a neurologist or a psychologist who specializes in synesthesia, because they can help you understand your specific type and any challenges or benefits that might come with it. And they can offer guidance and support if you're dealing with any of the social or cognitive aspects of it. So we mentioned earlier how some people with synesthesia might not even realize they have it, right? It's like if you've always seen the world in full color, you might not realize that other people are seeing it in black and white. And for a lot of people with synesthesia, these experiences are so ingrained in their perception that they just assume that everyone else is experiencing the same thing. It's often not until they try to explain it, and people are like, wait, what? That they realize, oh, this is unique to me, which must be a pretty strange experience to suddenly realize that something you thought was totally normal is actually quite unusual. But it could also be a kind of relief to finally understand why you experience things the way you do. It could be a real journey of self-discovery. So it seems like exploring these different sensory connections, whether you're born with them or you've tried to develop them, can really help us understand our own minds better, which is a great takeaway. We've covered all these different types of synesthesia, explored potential advantages and disadvantages, and even gotten a glimpse into the research that's being done. But we've only just scratched the surface. The world of synesthesia is vast, and there's still so much left to discover. And as we wrap up this exploration of the subject, one thing that really strikes me is that this whole phenomenon has these implications that go way beyond just the individual. Synesthesia can teach us a lot about, well, how we view differences in general, and it really highlights that there isn't just one right way to experience the world. What might seem totally strange or unusual to one person can be completely normal, even beneficial to someone else. And it underscores how important it is to really embrace neurodiversity and to appreciate all those unique perspectives that different people bring to the table. Like, people with synesthesia perceive the world differently. There are countless other ways that our brains can be wired uniquely. And instead of thinking of those differences as problems, we should recognize them as strength. Think about something like autism or ADHD. They often come with challenges, but they can also bring these exceptional talents and abilities. People with autism often have this incredible attention to detail or a deep passion for certain subjects. And folks with ADHD might thrive in these really fast-paced environments, bursting with creative energy. So instead of trying to force everyone into this narrow box of normal, we should be celebrating the full spectrum of what it means to be human, recognizing and actually valuing neurodiversity. That's how we create a more inclusive and equitable society, where everyone has a chance to reach their full potential. And I think synesthesia, in its own way, helps us imagine that kind of world. It challenges us to rethink what's possible, and to really appreciate the incredible diversity of the human mind. Now, I want to circle back to something that I mentioned earlier about some of the potential downsides of synesthesia, specifically those social challenges and the possibility of sensory overload. It's important to remember that even though synesthesia is often seen as a gift or a special ability, it can come with real difficulties. Like we were talking about how someone with sound-colored synesthesia could find loud, busy environments to be completely overwhelming. Think about a crowded city street. You've got car horns, music blaring from every store, people talking all around you. If you're seeing all those sounds as colors, it could be a sensory overload nightmare. It would be like this constant barrage of visual information, and it would be really hard to focus or even function in that kind of setting. And then you have that social piece that we talked about earlier, trying to explain to someone that you taste words or that you see days of the week as having personalities. It's no wonder that so many synesthetes end up facing disbelief and maybe even ridicule. People might think that they're making things up, and it can be a very lonely and frustrating experience, especially for kids who are still trying to figure out who they are and how they fit in. So while we celebrate all the unique perspectives that synesthesia offers, we also need to be sensitive to the challenges that synesthetes might experience. It's all about finding that balance, appreciating the differences, but also providing support when it's needed. And that goes for neurodiversity as a whole, really. We need to create environments that are inclusive and accommodating to people with all sorts of sensory experiences and ways of thinking. We need to move past this idea of one size fits all and recognize that different doesn't mean less than. It's about embracing the whole amazing tapestry of human experience and building a society where everyone feels valued and respected for who they are. This exploration of synesthesia has hopefully made us question our assumptions, broadened our awareness, and maybe even left us feeling inspired by the sheer potential of the human mind. I think it's a great reminder that we're all constantly learning about ourselves, each other, the world around us, and that the world is so much richer and more vibrant because of the differences that make each of us unique. And that's it for this week's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this dive into the fascinating world of synesthesia. Next week, we'll be heading back into the topic of grief and all about trying to comprehend tragedy. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to live with a dose of wonder.